Hello everyone, this is Mr. Salmingo. This video is about Science Section 2, and it's about community ecology. Sorry for the gruesome picture here. Those of you that love animals or zebras, or sorry, it's the way of life. So this video, trying to keep it short again, we're going to talk about ecology, this time revolving around communities. Okay. So first of all, one big term or one big thing that you might have read was about biodiversity. Okay. Biodiversity, as you can see by the name, diversity, I think you guys all know that. Diversity meaning different things or just differences of things and existing in the same place. And obviously the prefix bio meaning life. Okay. So biodiversity meaning the variation of life. And you need this because diversity helps support the living of all organisms. And without diversity, it's harder for different organisms, different things to live. Okay. Species diversity, which you see is one of the types of biodiversity, is basically the species richness or the relative evenness. Okay, richness is the number of different species within an area. So if you have a number of different species in one area, that's what you mean. That's what you are referring to as the richness of species, and it defines the complexity of a community. That's different than something called species evenness. Evenness means the relative percentage that each species contributes to the total number of organisms. So evenness meaning, like percentages. So it's like 25% lions, 25% monkeys, 25% that. That's what you mean by evenness. So like maybe you have a whole bunch of richness, but the percentages are a little bit off. So that's what we just want to make it clear that you understand the difference between richness and evenness. Okay. Now, this diversity can actually refer to, or commonly thought of as species diversity. Okay, in a community ecology, biodiversity typically refers to species diversity. Okay, and there's different types of diversity, or way we can describe or define it. So the diversity of biodiversity. All right, one way it could be diverse is genetically. So if the genetic makeup within a population, that is considered diverse. Okay, so you may have remembered in your biology classes something called alleles. These alleles, if they're different, they result in maybe different physical differences or adaptations. And then this genetic biodiversity, why it's great, is that if you have a lot of great genetic diversity, if you have a changing environmental condition, I'll give you an example or a story. There was a time where, and still is, where bananas had the same genetic makeup. And what happened was that there was I don't even know what it was, but like some sort of sickness or disease or something that affected bananas. And because there wasn't very much diversity, all the bananas were killed off, okay? Which is bad. You want a lot of genetic diversity, which means that if something were to happen, like a disease or something that's spread through, if you have a lot of genetic diversity, then all the bananas wouldn't be dead and that species would still be living, okay? Species diversity, which we already talked about. So we're talking about the richness and the evenness of different species found in a community. And then there's ecosystem diversity, which is a variation in the different communities within an ecosystem. So making sure that there's a lot of different communities within the same ecosystem. So the global patterns of biodiversity. Scientists estimate there may be somewhere between 5 and 30 million species present in the world, but only 1.7 of them have been identified. So there's a lot of diversity. These species are not evenly distributed. So you may notice that some of them are, in the tropics or close to the equator, you have a lot more diversity. So there says here there's a gradient, and where there's very little diversity is at the poles. So North Pole, Antarctica, there's very little diversity, whereas there's a lot of diversity along in the tropics or along the equator. Okay. In the U.S., there is a greater diversity in tree species as you move from north to south. So again, as you get closer and closer to the equator, you get more diversity. And small islands have low biodiversity, and that's just because there's not a lot of, one, there's not a lot of space, and two, a lot of these small island ecosystems, they're kind of new ecosystems, whereas ones that are mainlands have been around for a long time. There are currently 35 places in the world that have high biodiversity, and they're threatened by human activity, and those are called biodiversity hotspots. So right here it says there are 35, and they're the focus of conservation efforts. Okay. And then lastly, evolution over geologic time has led to an overall increase in biodiversity. So as time goes on, animals, organisms, they evolve, and that increases biodiversity. So that's also, because of evolution, has increased our biodiversity. So you may be wondering, or maybe not wondering, what causes biodiversity? So we're going to talk about 6 different things that cause biodiversity. The first one is called the evolutionary speed hypothesis. This says that there are more species in areas like the tropics because of something called speciation. Speciation meaning that species form. You may be wondering, what is speciation? What do you mean species are forming? It's kind of like you have a, I don't know, making up an example here, like a dog. But then some dogs eventually have an adaptation, like they have gigantic hind legs that help them live or survive in that environment. And eventually, if those adaptations build and build and build over years and years, eventually those two, like the original dog and the mutant dog with super hind legs, become so different that they don't even mate anymore. That's what you call speciation. Just after a while, an animal kind of morphs into two different species. That's called speciation. Okay. This hypothesis says that high diversity in some areas, there are higher biodiversity in some areas because of higher rate of speciation for longer periods. Okay. So basically, because it's been happening longer in some areas, that's why there's more biodiversity. Okay. Possible factors that maybe cause this increased rate in speciation could be, for example, higher temperatures. We talked about things closer to the equator, and we'll talk about that later on. Okay. For example, about the evolutionary speed hypothesis, the Hawaiian Islands have low species richness due to the relatively short geologic age. So Hawaii, I know it's been around for a while, but relative to the mainlands, to everything else, actually has it's very young. Geographic area hypothesis, it states that larger land areas with more diverse habitats support greater biodiversity than smaller areas, which makes a lot of sense because if you have a larger area, by default, it's probably more likely to be more diverse, and because it's more diverse, you're more likely to have greater, or the habitats are more likely to be diverse, which means the animals are more likely to be diverse. Okay. So, for example, the tropics have much larger open land than temperate zones with higher biodiversity. Okay. And the last one on this slide, interspecific interactions hypotheses. This states that higher species diversity in the tropics is actually associated with greater competition and predation. So in higher latitude regions with really crazy physical conditions, you have more competition, more predation, and more diversity. So that's saying that in places like the tropics, like the rainforests, because there's so many different animals with different powers, different adaptations, you get more biodiversity because there's more of a struggle. The struggle is real to live. Okay? So, for example, tropics have milder abiotic conditions that promote interspecific competition, results in higher species diversity. Okay. 3 more causes of biodiversity. One is called the ambient energy hypothesis. This says that higher biodiversity in some areas due to the presence of more solar energy. So this is what I was talking about, why there's more diversity in warm areas. So you may be wondering, hey, Mr. Samingo, why is there more diversity, across the equator or in the tropics or in the rainforest, in that middle part of the globe? Why is there more biodiversity? And the reason why is because that part of the globe gets more sun. Because that part of the world gets more sun, that means that more plants and types of plants can live in those areas because of photosynthesis. And because there's more types of plants, there's more different types of animals that can eat those plants and more animals that can eat those animals. So that's what they call the ambient energy hypothesis. There's more higher biodiversity in places that have more solar energy. So the tropics that have warmer climates are favorable for growth. Okay. The productivity hypothesis is that the production or the rate of biomass in an ecosystem, we talked about biomass in the last presentation or video, results in more biodiversity. Okay. So higher biodiversity rates results in higher production of biomass. Okay. This actually seems to contradict data from diverse communities with low productivity, such as the South African Finbo. So what this means is that, there are diverse communities, like in South Africa, but they don't have a lot of biomass. So this is kind of like one that's been, you see the X here? It's kind of been debunked. And lastly, the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. This states that small periodic disturbances, like a disease, a flood, a fire, things like that, those limit species exclusion and actually promote biodiversity. So every time there's an occasional disaster, that actually improves biodiversity because there's more speciation. Again, we have to adapt more. So in terms of what causes biodiversity, one thing that can cause biodiversity is more of these small, moderate, punctuated disturbances. Not crazy ones, not like a gigantic earthquake or a crazy fire, but small, moderate ones contribute to this biodiversity. So that's video 1 of this Science Section 2. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll see y'all later.